Good morning. How's everybody doing this morning? Have fun last night, hopefully, wherever you went. All right, well, welcome. Welcome to the second day of IASSIST. It feels like we've been here a lot longer, but I'm very excited for the things we have today. My name is Linda Kellum. I'm the head of Research Data Services at the University of Pennsylvania and the secretary of IASSIST. And we have some great sessions planned for you today. I want to just do a few housekeeping things. One is that we have a special session called Birds of a Feather. This will be after lunch, and in this session we'll take topics from the audience, from the group, and create discussion groups around those topics. If you have a topic, there's a flip chart out at the registration desk. Please add any topics you have to it by lunch. So Robin needs some time to be able to coordinate, so make sure you add some topics. We have a couple up there to get us started. But we would love to have a few more. And if there's topics from the sessions that you're in, that would be a great place to start. When it comes to the business lunch, please remember that all are welcome. Even if you're not a dues-paying member of IASSIST, you are welcome to the business lunch, and we encourage you to come to learn more about what we're doing. Please bring your meal card. That will be your ticket for your meal, so make sure you have that. And the agenda and reports were sent to the IASSIST listserv, the conference list, and the Slack channel, both of them. So please make sure you take a look at those. Tonight we are going on a boat, as you have heard, as we tend to do. The boat boards at 5:30 p.m. from 101 South Christopher Columbus Boulevard. It launches promptly at 6 p.m., so please be there. We don't want anyone launching themselves onto the boat from trying to get on it. If you would like to meet at the hotel lobby, you can find people to walk over there. I meant to look up how long it will take to walk over. I did not, but we can send that out. It's a very short walk. It's about 10 minutes. You can also arrange that on Slack. You can also look for me, and I'll walk over with you if you want to do that. Don't forget your green ticket. That is what gets you on the boat. All right? That is not your drink ticket, that is what gets you on the boat. Once you are on the boat, you will have 2 drink tickets, and then it becomes a cash bar. So, sorry. 2 drinks is enough, probably for me at least. All right, so I'm very excited, as a new Philadelphian, I'm very excited to announce our speaker today, or introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Erik Larson. He serves as the Deputy Director of LGBT Affairs for the City of Philadelphia. In this role, he has successfully advocated for the collection of sexual orientation and gender identity data among the city's 30,000 plus member workforce. As a result of this initiative, he has worked alongside the mayor's policy team to develop comprehensive guidelines for supporting members of the city's workforce who are transitioning on the job. As the city of Philadelphia continues to make history as a progressive leader for our LGBTQ plus communities, and as anti-LGB and trans legislation has reached an all-time high in recent years, the city is proud to use data to inform its policies and practices in creating more inclusive, supportive, and safer spaces for LGBTQ plus people. So Erik will take questions at the end of the presentations. When we do the Q&A, we'll have a mic passing around. Thank you so much for joining us today, Erik.
Thank you, Dr. Kellum. Thank you, IASSIST, for inviting me to speak this morning. It is an honor to be in this room of esteemed information specialists, data librarians, and technology professionals from around the world. But I look out at this room and I recognize that I'm also in a room full of storytellers, each of you equipped with your own special abilities and tools in the fight for social justice around the world. Now, when I was first approached to join you today, I was hesitant because I didn't know that I was the right person for this keynote. You see, I didn't begin my career as a social scientist, and I don't consider myself a data expert per se. So I wondered what my value would be to share with you all, because it is a supremely humbling experience to find yourself in front of a room of experts, here to gain your insights and knowledge when at first thought you may not feel like you're the right message deliverer yourself. But with some more careful consideration, I realized that what I can share with you is how to recognize your unique power, harness it, and use it to make the world a better place. And through my experiences, how throughout my life and career, I learned to do exactly that. So to illustrate what led me to this point, allow me to share some of my origin story with you. To begin, I will say that I've always been interested in social impact and supporting my communities, being an active volunteer, being an engaged citizen from the time I was very young. And when I was in high school, I participated in the local AIDS walk year after year with the student theater troupe, of which I was the vice president. Thank you very much. And as an undergraduate in college, I was active in THON, which is the largest student-led philanthropy in the world, working to end childhood cancer. And now throughout my graduate studies and up until today, where I now serve as a government official supporting the LGBTQ community in one of the largest cities in the United States. Now, as I said, I did not begin my career in social impact. I actually started out in the arts. I studied fine art for years in high school and on through higher education as well. And I went to Penn State University for my undergraduate studies. I'm actually from State College, Pennsylvania, which is where Penn State is. And in my high school, if you had plans to go to college, those plans were to go to Penn State. And at the time, I was interested in arts and theater, but I should clarify or maybe defend myself, I was not an actor. I worked behind the scenes as a designer, specifically as a costume designer. And I think I was so drawn to that because I loved being able to share people's stories. Costume design gave me the opportunity to tell stories through the way that people dress and what they communicate about themselves and their personal narrative through how they show up in the world. And it was compelling to me as a young person who loved people and loved being a storyteller. So I decided to study costume design in undergrad at Penn State. And it was through that work that I gained a skill set that was very valuable to a very niche area, or so I thought at the time. And then when I came to graduate from Penn State several years later, I didn't know what to do next. And what does one do when they don't know what to do next in life? They go to graduate school. So I found myself at Carnegie Mellon University, acclaimed research university in Pittsburgh, filled with some of the world's preeminent scholars in robotics, science, technology. And what did I study there? Also costume design. So then I received an even more specialized education and now a master's degree in a field that is, again, very niche. Now, of course, I'm proud of the experience that I gained there, but in my view, at the time, it wasn't exactly transferable skills that I was developing. So when I graduated from Carnegie Mellon University, I moved out west to Los Angeles to work in the entertainment industry, and that did not last very long for me. I was there for about a year and a half just doing the grind, and while I was fortunate to have steady work, it was very challenging. And I began to realize that it wasn't really fulfilling to me anymore. Now, to put this timeline into context, this was 2014, 2015, and at this time there was a real sentiment growing in the country of changing political winds. This was the advent of the 2016 presidential election in the United States, and during that period I had begun to feel like my work, dressing celebrities for red carpet events or up-and-coming musicians for their music videos, as much as I used to enjoy it, I knew I wanted to be able to bring to the world something that could be more useful to more people and make more of an impact in my community. So I left Los Angeles, I moved back to the East Coast, here to Philadelphia, where I had family and a few friends, and I started volunteering again because I wanted to get involved in my new community here. So I started doing a couple gigs at William Way, which is the LGBT community center here. And before I knew it, the election had happened. The result, I imagine we all remember. And from there, I was really determined that I needed to take my volunteerism and my passion for social impact to the next level. So I began to research my options for furthering my education in social impact, and I came across this incredible opportunity at the University of Pennsylvania. Now, being in Philadelphia, I was aware of Penn's influence in the city, But for me to consider gaining the knowledge and expertise that came along with a graduate degree from an Ivy League institution like Penn turned out to be even more valuable than I could have even imagined in the moment. The program, a Master of Science degree in nonprofit leadership, promised that we would learn to create social impact through thoughtful, inventive, and meaningful work in nonprofits, charitable foundations, international NGOs, and more, and that it was ideal for existing nonprofit professionals, those looking to change their careers, or like me, were launching a career in a new sector. Now, of course, all of this sounded good on paper, but I had a few reservations. A, would I need to take a standardized exam to apply, because I didn't know how I was going to do that. And honestly, if I had to, I might not go through with it. And B, would I have to write a thesis? Because the idea of writing a second thesis after already completing one in such a niche, specialized field was a very daunting task to me at the time. So in the pursuit of more knowledge and to quell my fears, I set up an informational interview with one of the academic advisors in the program, and they assured me that I did not have to do either of those things, so that pretty much sealed the deal for me. I put an application essay together, and I leaned heavily on what drew me to the program and my experience to this point in nonprofits. Now, whether I realized it at the time or not, I had been working in an arts and theater background, so I was working in nonprofits for years. So many theaters operate as nonprofits, and I felt either as an arts administrator or maybe as a budding social scientist working in a more traditional social impact nonprofit, that having skills in the leadership of nonprofits was a valuable opportunity for me to pursue. So I submitted my application, and to my surprise, I was pleased to be accepted to UPenn School of Social Policy and Practice, and I started with courses that summer and joined classmates from all over the world with varied interests and backgrounds and unique journeys that brought them to this program and what they had hoped to pursue post-graduation. And I was especially intrigued to see that there were plenty of fellow classmates who had backgrounds in the arts but now wanted to focus their skills on social impact. I think it was a sign of the times. Let me just take this opportunity to say that the theater to politics or theater to government pipeline is very real. It's what brought me to UPenn and the mayor's office and eventually to this stage today and this moment right now. So that is to say, you really never know where your career journey is going to take you. So here I was at Penn, surrounded by folks from all walks of life, varied interests from all over the world, gaining a real formative education in everything that doing successful social impact work entails. Everything from fiscal management of nonprofits to governance and responsibilities of board members, executive leadership, strategic planning, marketing and communication, development and fundraising. Every aspect of what it takes to run an NGO and be an effective social impact leader, we covered. And I was thrilled with my experience in the classroom and to gain such valuable knowledge and insight from my professors. But one of the most valuable opportunities that came to me while I was a student in that program was through my field placement. So for those of you who are familiar with social work studies, most programs require you to work a certain number of hours in the field for you to contribute to earning your degree. And while my degree is not in social work, it had a similar structure. We're actually housed in the same school at Penn. So we were required to work a number of hours in the field, and we were provided a whole list of attractive options to choose from. And while there were many options on this predetermined list, I had my sights set on one unlisted opportunity in particular. I wanted to work with the City of Philadelphia government, and specifically in the mayor's office of LGBT affairs. Now, the Office of LGBT Affairs was already on my radar because the then executive director of that office was an alumni of Penn School of Social Policy and Practice. And why I wanted to work with this organization, and with her in particular, was because she had used the power of design and storytelling to create social impact in her community. So let me just pause for a moment to acknowledge today's date. Today is June 1st, the first day of LGBT Pride Month here in the United States and many countries around the world. And as you may be aware, one of the most iconic and enduring symbols of LGBTQ pride the world around is the rainbow flag. Now, the original flag itself was created by an activist named Gilbert Baker back in the mid-'70s, just a few years after the Stonewall Uprising, which is what is widely considered to be the birth of the contemporary LGBTQ civil rights movement in this country. And Baker's original flag had 8 stripes on it. pink, red, orange, yellow, green, turquoise, blue, and violet, and each represented a specific meaning and connection to gay life. Now, eventually, due to the ease of production, turquoise and pink were dropped, and the six-stripe rainbow flag that can be found everywhere from corporate pride campaigns to emojis on your phone was born. But in recent years, a new version of the flag has taken hold, and one that many in the community now associate with pride. And this new version of the flag extends beyond the traditional six stripes of the rainbow, including the addition of black and brown stripes. And what you may not know is that those black and brown stripes were actually added right here in Philadelphia at the Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs, where I currently serve as the Deputy Director, and where I got my first professional opportunity as an emerging social impact leader at my field placement all those years ago at the University of Pennsylvania. This version of the flag, officially called the More Color, More Pride flag, debuted in 2017. So at this time, we are now living under the Trump administration in the United States. It was one of the more actively adversarial federal governments towards our community in recent memory. The Ryan White program, a federally operated HIV and AIDS support program, had its funds diverted to increasing migrant detentions at the southern border. And across the country, there's been a notable uptick in hate crimes and violence against minority communities. And one of the areas that Philadelphia saw a significant increase was in anti-Black discrimination, particularly in certain businesses in the city's neighborhood. Now, you've been in Philadelphia for a couple of days. If this is your first time here, welcome. We hope you're enjoying your visit. Come back and stay sometime. But if you've been here before, then surely you know, or you've at least heard of our vibrant neighborhood. It's actually not far from here. It's just a few blocks over, right in Center City. And you can't miss the rainbow crosswalks at the intersection of 13th and Locust. Now, our neighborhood is a beautiful melting pot of LGBTQ cultures, rich with history, because Philadelphia actually played its own role in LGBT civil rights that in some ways predates New York and the Stonewall uprisings of 1969. So I encourage you to check it out while you're here, and if you go, tell my friends at Knock Lounge I say hi. Now, back at the time in 2017, there was a number of bars and nightclubs and businesses in the city's neighborhood that had adopted discriminatory practices against members of color in the LGBTQ community in the city. Many of the nightclubs had racially coded policies that were very clearly meant to keep certain people out. For example, no fitted baseball caps, no baggy jeans, no Timberland boots, all very clearly meant to keep folks of a certain demographic out of their establishment. So this was brought to the attention of the city's then executive director of LGBT affairs and the first Black femme to lead that office, Amber Hikes, who, by the way, uses pronouns she and they interchangeably, as I will when I refer to her. So in their role, they worked closely with the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations, which is the city's civil rights enforcement agency. And following a series of hearings, one of the first things that Amber did was to partner with a marketing agency to create a visual symbol that helped the community understand that their concerns were being prioritized. And that symbol came in the form of what became to be known as the More Color, More Pride flag. Now, for some additional context, Amber stepped into this role at a time of great tumultuousness, not only because of an increasingly hostile federal government at the time, but because her predecessor had been asked to resign from her role because she was not meeting the needs of the community appropriately at the time. So Amber, having a very different approach and being a social worker herself, graduate of Penn Social Policy and Practice, wanted to make sure that she was meeting the community's needs head on and being receptive and understanding their concerns. So at the time, Amber took the concerns that the community brought back to them and thought, I need to make a bold statement. I'm new to this job, and I need to do something that's going to assure the community that I have their back and that I'm here listening to them. And so she partnered with a marketing agency to take on the redesign of the iconic rainbow flag. Now, this just also happened to coincide with this time of year because it was just the beginning of Pride season, and she wanted to debut the new flag for LGBT Pride at the city's annual flag-raising event. So with the guidance of artists and designers at this marketing agency and her social impact focus, they took the traditional six-stripe rainbow design and made it 8 stripes once again, adding black and brown stripes as a visual representation of that symbolic commitment of the city's priority to always centering the needs of our black and brown folks who make up the majority of the city's LGBTQ community and who had long felt ignored or worse, discriminated against. So came the creation of the More Color, More Pride flag. And there's an interesting element that I want to point out. So notably, the design is not copyrighted, and that was an intentional choice because Amber felt strongly that it's not the place of any government to tell a community how they're supposed to celebrate Pride or what their Pride looks like or what the official Pride flag is. They wanted this design to be adaptable and usable for communities, not just in Philadelphia, but around the world. And the design certainly did make international shockwaves as it's become to use increasingly commonly all around the world. Now, when the flag itself debuted, it was picked up by national and international press, and while many people celebrated the flag, there were as many, if not more, detractors from its design, including people from around the world. Gay Times UK wrote at the time that certain parts of the community rejected the flag, claiming that Black activists had hijacked a symbol of pride. Some went so far as to even extend threats to Amber and members of the office, and being the hero that she is, they took it in stride and continued to make waves around the world with this design and the subsequent policy work that followed. So after the unveiling of the flag, the Office of LGBT Affairs, in partnership with the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations, compiled the results of their findings from those hearings and created a detailed report with actionable steps to address the community's concerns, including mandatory implicit bias trainings for bar and nightclub managers, increased monitoring of their actions that followed, and swift enforcement if they failed to comply. The city's anti-discrimination enforcement agency was firm in their commitment to making lasting change, stating in the report that it provided a rare opportunity to address racism head-on, and that the neighborhood had an opportunity to model a neighborhood that has made intentional change and could serve as an example for other communities. I knew back then, before I even began my studies at Penn, that I wanted to work with Amber Hikes and in the Office of LGBT Affairs, because as a former artist and designer, to see firsthand how the transformative ability of something as simple as a visual symbol, like a flag, can speak to the power of social impact and positive change. And I knew that if I could be in the room with a great mind like that, then my possibilities were limitless. So when it came time to interview for field placement opportunities, I approached the director of my program at Penn and I said, I understand you want us to work at a nonprofit. This is the government. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's still social impact work, and this is really important to me. And he understood and suggested that I make a connection. I was thrilled. Now I just had to convince the mayor's office that they wanted me. So I reached out via a cold email to my predecessor, the then deputy director of the office, who was tasked with staffing student interns, and I said, hi, I'm an interested graduate student. I've seen your office's incredible work with the new Pride flag, and it would be my honor to work with you. Weeks passed, no response. Not taking no for an answer, I sent a second email and maybe an overzealous voicemail, or like 5 or 6. And much to my surprise, eventually I received an offer letter signed by the mayor himself asking me to show up on this day and get started. I was shocked and amazed that my campaign to join the office had worked. Some may call it bullying, I'd like to call it forceful advocacy, but either way I was in. So I arrived at City Hall for the first day on the job on October 1st of 2018. And it proved to be a very auspicious beginning because October is actually LGBT History Month in the United States and many countries around the world. And it felt like a history-making moment for me, the perfect opportunity to combine both of my interests, which were social impact, particularly through politics and government, and LGBTQ community engagement. And for all of that to coincide on the first day of LGBT History Month felt like a watershed moment for me in my life and in my career. To walk the hallways of City Hall and work alongside leaders that I so admired. So, being the beginning of LGBTQ History Month, I spent my first day on the job working alongside a few of the other office interns, reviewing historical artifacts from across the city's LGBTQ community to be displayed gallery style in these like art cases across City Hall. And I remember getting dirty, crawling around on my hands and knees with masking tape and push pins, trying to figure out how to attach this drag queen's old dress that had been made out of newspaper to some corkboard backing, and all the while wondering to myself, is this what working in government is really like? And I must say, it really is. Some days you're testifying on legislation before city council, and other days you're holding it all together with masking tape and push pins. So as much as I was a bit confused by it at the time, I look back on that period now with fondness because it really set the tone for what was to come. So once I began working in City Hall, it was definitely a steep learning curve for me. For somebody who had only casually volunteered or worked at a few nonprofits in the past, to diving headfirst into the deep end, managing one of our country's largest cities, particularly one of our country's largest poor cities, and with a majority population people of color. And it was a challenge for me to navigate both personally and professionally as a white, cisgender male working alongside Amber Hikes, who was unapologetically queer, black, and non-binary. They grew to become one of my personal heroes and mentors, and I came to learn something from them over time. But it didn't happen overnight. There were many points along my journey where they helped me recognize the power of my privilege and how to weaponize my identity for the greater good. At this time, I was the only white person working in the mayor's office of LGBT affairs, and to my knowledge, the only white male person who had ever worked in that office. So I felt a great deal of anxiety and confusion around my selection to participate in the office, and certainly a pressure to perform at a level of excellence to effectively earn my keep and my position there. I wanted to be worthy of the opportunity. But at the same time, I found myself withholding my feelings or my insights, no matter how valuable I thought they were. And I recall on more than a few occasions being asked to speak up or participate in meetings more because I didn't want to take up space as the lone white voice in the room or the lone male in the room, or often both. It was important to me that I was making space and providing opportunity for others, not taking it up for myself. But my hesitance began to fade on my second day in the office when Amber click-clacked down the hall in her stilettos and signature colorful power suit. I can see it now. And she scans the office full of anxious-looking interns, points at me and goes, you're coming with me upstairs right now. Now, I didn't know what was happening, but I was just thrilled to be included. So I had no idea what I was walking into or signing up for, and had I known, I probably would have backed out. And at this point, I didn't even think Amber knew my name. I had only been there a couple of days, and here I was getting dragged upstairs and through the imposing wrought iron gates of the mayor's executive office on the second floor. And as we're walking upstairs, I became particularly conscious of my attire, dressed on the more casual side of what we call business casual. I was wearing a polo shirt, not a suit, nothing like this. And after my first day on the job doing arts and crafts, I knew better, so I thought. Thinking this day was no different, I was dressed casually, and lo and behold, Amber and I, round the corner, walk into a wood-paneled cabinet room with a 50-foot-long table in it, the mayor seated at one end, the police commissioner at the other, and dozens of uniformed police officers down either side. And when I tell you, I almost fainted. I almost did. And commanding the room, as she was wont to do, Amber introduced herself as the executive director of LGBT affairs, and much to my surprise, knowing my name, introduced me as her policy fellow, which I appreciated, not being called an intern. And sitting down, turned to me quietly and asked me to take notes during our meeting. Hearing their impassioned advocacy on the subject of the day, which was developing a policy with the Philadelphia Police Department to guide their interactions with transgender residents, had me awestruck. The mayor, the police commissioner, and dozens of the other men in the room sat rapt at attention throughout this hours-long meeting. And afterwards, Amber pulled me aside and said, "Do you know I asked you to come with me to this meeting?" I said, "No, I really don't. What was that about?" She answered, "Because I needed somebody who looked like you to sit beside me in that room full of mostly white men and help them to pay attention." I had never felt that way about my identity before, and it stayed with me in my professional development ever since. At that point, I began to realize that my identity could be a useful tool in this work, and that I had the right to be here and was just as valuable in this position as anybody else. So after that moment, the academic year progressed on, and before I knew it, I was preparing for graduation. And I did not have another job or position, opportunity lined up, and as timing would have it, Amber pulled me aside one of the days as we're approaching graduation and said, "Hey, I want to talk to you about something." I said, "Okay." "Have you ever considered working in this office full-time?" I replied probably too enthusiastically, "Yes, of course, I would love to, but I didn't realize there was a position for me. Both the positions are filled." Yes, the mayor's office for a city with 1.5 million residents only has 2 full-time staff dedicated to LGBT affairs. And that's when they told me they were planning to resign as the executive director of the office, and that the then deputy director was likely going to replace her. And that meant that the deputy position was going to be open, and that she wanted me to serve as that next deputy. I was floored at the opportunity. In fact, I believe the first words out of my mouth at the time were, "Shut up, really." But despite my protestations, she calmed me down, as she had so many times before, and reminded me of my own superpower. Amber said, "Look, I know you, I know your ethics, I know your politics and your priorities, and I know that we share these things together. I know that you're committed to prioritizing Black and brown folks in our community, trans folks in our community, disabled folks in our community, people who need vocal advocacy in City Hall. And I know that we share these priorities, but there's a lot of rooms that you're going to be in where people will be much more open to hearing those priorities coming out of your white gay guy mouth than they'll hear it coming from my Black queer self." And after I thought about it more, I realized that the deliverer of the message can sometimes be just as valuable and as important as the message itself. Prior to that moment, I had seldom given it much consideration, but after that interaction, I really held it with me and took it to heart, because I realized how much value there is in the power of your identity as an individual. So time progressed. I graduated with a Master of Science degree. Amber left their role for a new one with the ACLU, and spoiler alert, the deputy director did not go on to get the executive director position, and eventually a new executive director named Selena Morrison was selected to lead the office the following year. That year being 2020, specifically the spring of 2020, and specifically the second week of March of 2020. I don't know if any folks remember what happened at that time, but it was a pretty consequential period, and I would say human history. So begins my boss, new Selena. I'm still working in the office, still as an entry-level kind of coordinator position, and all of a sudden the entire world shuts down, and we begin unexpectedly working from home with my poor new boss not even days into the job. And I thought for sure I'm going to get the axe, because I figured there was no way that lowly little me was going to make the cut as dozens of heads were rolling across the mayor's office. But as luck, opportunity, fate, whatever you want to call it, would have it, I was spared, because there was no one else left to train the new executive director who had worked in LGBT affairs and knew the ropes already. So I stayed. And I've been with the office ever since, eventually going on to become its deputy director the following year. And Selena and I have made a great team in that time. But when she accepted her role back in 2020, she actually made history by being the first openly trans person, and certainly trans person of color, to lead a city office here in the city of Philadelphia. And it was a history-making accomplishment, to be sure, but just like me, she had not worked in the government. She also came from a nonprofit background, and it was a really steep learning curve, not only for us to be both stepping into new positions, but also navigating this once-in-a-century global pandemic just days into a new job. So we reached for the proverbial masking tape and push pins and figured it out as we went. And one of the first things that we realized in those early days of the pandemic, and certainly became more apparent over time, was that the disparities that already existed in our society that affected the LGBTQ community adversely, or the disabled community, or communities of color, were greatly exacerbated and did, to our worst fears, grow worse over the course of the pandemic. As we saw, there were folks who already struggled with access to food, now having no way to get to the grocery store safely and get their meals. Or folks who struggled with access to medical service, with no way to visit a doctor without compromising their health, or delicate medical situations even further, and the list goes on and on. So we leapt into action at the opportunity to provide support for some of our city's vulnerable communities. And one of the ways we provided support was to create a database that centralized all of the resources that were emerging, specifically affirming to our LGBTQ community. Now, Selena said at the time, there are some members in our community who are not going to patronize a business or attend an event or receive health care from a provider without seeing a rainbow symbol somewhere in their office, because they need to know that they'll feel prioritized and safe when they're there. And I think that's an accurate assessment. Our community was in crisis. They needed to know that their providers had their backs. So what we were able to draw on after a few weeks of working from home, virtually meeting every single day with local social service organizations who, of course, were in panic mode themselves, was begin to figure out how we can meet the needs of our community in this time of unprecedented challenge.
So I began to compile a list of all the available resources for our communities across the city of Philadelphia, because the last thing that folks needed, in my view, as they're trying to struggle to access their health care in the middle of a pandemic, was to be misgendered, met with insensitive or lack of affirming care, or treated with discrimination while they're in the middle of a pandemic and a health crisis. So we worked quickly to develop what became known as Coping During COVID, a resource guide for our LGBTQ communities in the city of Philadelphia. I pitched the story to a local newspaper, and overnight hundreds of residents began to use the database as an essential tool to keep themselves afloat during the pandemic, and to this day, it remains one of my proudest accomplishments in the role to date. And I look back at that time and I realized that, like everyone, we were truly just making it up as we went, masking tape and push pins. The resource guide was nothing technologically groundbreaking. It was just a publicly accessible Google Doc that was continuously updated as certain resources became available or had expired. And the guide itself was regularly updated with these services until as recently as a few months ago, when we eventually pivoted from being a COVID resource guide to a more evergreen resource of community supports that now exists on our page on phila.gov. And it's still regularly used by our community members. But at that time, in the early days of the pandemic, it was a lifeline for our communities, and one that got serious traction, not only here in local news, but became a model that we were able to share with our community partners and sibling offices across the country. Now, one of the things that makes Philadelphia's Office of LGBT Affairs unique is that when it was created, first by mayoral executive order back in 2008, and then later voted on by Philadelphians via a ballot initiative in 2015, was that it was only the second office of its kind in the country, the first being in Washington, D.C. That is, a government agency at the municipal level which had the clear directive to be specifically geared towards supporting the city's LGBTQ residents. There had been liaison positions in the past, or folks who had LGBTQ issues as part of their portfolio, but at the time our office became a permanent part of the city charter, there were very few offices in the United States that had a specifically dedicated full-time staff whose sole priority was supporting the needs and interests of their city's communities. Today, I'm fortunate to be in a very different position in that we work regularly with a dozen or so of our sibling offices across the country. Every month, I meet with a group of LGBTQ government practitioners from all across the United States, from the West Coast to the East Coast to the Deep South, New York, San Francisco, Oregon, even Montana, and everywhere in between. And I'm so pleased that we now have this opportunity, that municipal governments are recognizing the need for dedicated support staff who are there to support their LGBTQ residents, particularly in areas where our communities are flying in the face of unfriendly political winds at the state and sometimes federal level. I truly believe it's an essential service. And I'm proud that Philadelphia was a leader on this front. Now, one of the advantages of having a network of fellow offices across the country is that we've leaned on one another to gain advice, learn from our successes and challenges, and look for ways to support one another's work. And it's been an incredibly valuable partnership, particularly over the last several years as we navigated the COVID pandemic from an LGBTQ perspective. We've also been working to make sure that we have accurate, usable, and reliable data for supporting these communities. Now, to this point, so much of our work, and certainly throughout the pandemic, was very externally facing. We had done a lot of what I call handshaking and baby kissing, the kind of community engagement work. And we famously hold half a dozen flag raisings to bring the community together for various ceremonial causes throughout the year. We also work closely with community partners, typically nonprofit social service agencies, healthcare settings, community centers, people like that. But one of the things that's also essential to our work in City Hall is making sure that we're not only supporting our external communities and those that we live and work with in the city, but also the folks that work for the city of Philadelphia. Now, the city employs tens of thousands of Philadelphians, and I say Philadelphian intentionally because, like many municipalities in the United States, there's a rule in our city charter that states that city employees must be residents of the city of Philadelphia, so I use that terminology intentionally. But to this point, so much of our work in LGBT affairs really relied on supporting our community members, external community partners, and organizations that worked beyond the walls of City Hall. And when my current boss, Selena, stepped into her new role, she brought a new vision and focus for the work of the office. She was very interested in supporting our city employees who identified as LGBTQ. But despite the city publishing an annual workforce profile report, which details the racial and ethnic demographic data of our employees, it became apparent that we didn't have a similar mechanism to capture data about sexual orientation or gender identity. So we had no way really to understand just how many LGBTQ people worked for the city of Philadelphia, and that's what we set out to change. Now, I'll again take this opportunity to remind you all that I don't consider myself a data scientist, despite my Master of Science degree. And I'm certainly not an expert in the field, but what I do have to offer to this point is my experiences in trying to build affirming data collection, storage, and usage practices for our city's workforce. And I imagine that's probably why I was invited here to speak today. Now, making changes to the operations of the municipal government in one of the largest cities in the United States is like turning the Titanic. Things move incredibly slowly, and as you may expect, there is a substantial amount of red tape and bureaucracy. So many people and departments, ones that you wouldn't even imagine, have to get involved and sign off on any initiative, big or small. And as I've said famously many times, I have to get permission from about 20 people to send an email or a tweet or anything else. I mean, maybe a tweet's like not a good example anymore, but you get the point. The reason I share this is to illustrate why perhaps such a momentous undertaking had not been taken on to this point. But we set out to build an affirming set of practices that supported our city's LGBTQ employees that was both holistic and intentional. And it became apparent to us early on that the scope of this work was going to be so substantial that we were going to need to take a multi-pronged approach. And as we began to bring in more and more partners from across the city, leaders from human resources, members of the mayor's policy office, some of the mayor's top advisors, folks in the law department, of course our partners at Oracle who operate our employee dashboard system, One Philly, we knew that we were going to need to be very clear in defining our goals for this initiative. And so we began to approach this work from multiple angles. We knew we needed some kind of survey mechanism to capture this data, and we wanted it to be accessible to our workforce, which is why we worked closely with Oracle software and One Philly, so that our employees could access it right from their dashboards, the same place that they went to fill out their weekly timesheets. And one of the things that was important to us from the beginning, so that we didn't skew our data, was that this survey was designed to be taken by all of our city employees, not just those who identify as LGBTQ. In fact, it was preferable that folks who didn't identify as LGBTQ participate in similar proportion to the folks who did, because we didn't want to skew our results to overrepresent the representation of LGBTQ folks in the workforce, lest we have inaccurate data. So we were constantly aware from the beginning that we wanted to be certain that this survey was not explicitly branded as being only for LGBTQ people. So by design, as I shared in an earlier example, some LGBT people only opting into something when there's a rainbow symbol on it, we felt really strongly that we did not want to have rainbow branding or refer to it as the LGBT employee survey or something like that. We wanted to intentionally separate such verbiage so that all employees felt comfortable and affirmed to access the survey as written. So bringing my storytelling and communication sensibilities to the table, I suggested we name the survey the Employee Self-Identification Census. I felt that by using language that folks already associated with demographic data collection and surveying their data, we would be able to maximize their participation amongst our city employees. And as such, the communications and messaging strategy around the census were similarly considered. We included language about making the city a more diverse and affirming place to work, but never explicitly called out the LGBTQ community by name. So when employees logged into One Philly on their dashboard, a pop-up message read, "The Employee Self-Identification Census is now live," which linked directly to the survey itself. And once in the survey, it asked 3 straightforward questions. What is your sexual orientation? What is your gender identity? And do you identify as transgender? And a range of the most common options were provided in each category, and respondents could choose to select what applied to them. We also ensured that each question had a choose not to disclose option, which I feel is critically important for any demographic data collection process, particularly as it pertains to the sensitivity around potentially outing people in the workplace, as so many of our departments have such a small handful of staff. So when evaluating our data, we wanted to ensure that our minimum sample sizes reflected that sensitivity. The Employee Self-Identification Census officially went live in the spring of last year, and since then we've seen an encouraging degree of participation. And while we're still actively collecting data from this initiative, we're pleased to share that we have a vast representation of identities from across the LGBTQ spectrum from departments throughout the city of Philadelphia. And while we have a long way to go, and there are many more respondents that we're hoping to gather before what we consider to have a reflective pool of data for the city, we are pleased to have such a wide range of identities. So now we're currently in the next phase of this process as we strategize how best to incentivize participation amongst employees, particularly those who may not work behind a desk, like our streets department or our Parks and Rec. Now that the census has been live for just over a year and has data has emerged from the initiative, our office noticed that we were also receiving calls from various departments across the city requesting support in navigating employees who may be transitioning on the job. And it became clear to us that there was need to do some more intentional work around building an affirming and supportive workplace environment for our transgender employees. Because, as I said earlier, the current executive director of our office made history as the first openly trans person to lead a city department in the city of Philadelphia. But that was only in 2020, just barely 3 years ago. And there was real need for us to put policies in place that would make the city a more affirming environment to work in, because if we, in theory, had more people who felt safe and affirmed in the workplace and coming out, then we should have plenty of more transgender people leading city offices and departments, but that just simply was not the case to this point. So we began our work on a set of policy guidelines to support our city's trans and transitioning employees. And the reason I separate the two, trans and transitioning, is because there may be supports in place for our transgender employees as they're being onboarded as new hires. In other words, those who are already out and proud of their trans identity. But as we were learning, there were plenty of folks who have worked for the city for years and had not come out to this point, or had been afraid to come out, or left the city before they came out, taking their talents to a different employer. And we wanted to make sure that as a central pillar of the mayor's administration, being a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that supporting our transitioning employees with affirming practices was critical to that commitment. So one of the ways that we began to approach this challenge was by calling on our community partners and fellow LGBT affairs offices from across the country. And in particularly, we worked with the San Francisco office of transgender initiatives, which is also helmed by a history-making trans individual named Pau Crego. Now, throughout our conversations, we began to see how we can build an environment that was supportive to employees who are transitioning on the job, including developing a timeline for the process, deciphering what specific steps an employee would need to take along the way, and who needs to be brought into their transition process and when, and how to make that as safe and affirming for them as possible. And what we were surprised to learn as we delved a little deeper into this work was that there was so little, if any, uniform guidance from the city on how to support our transgender employees. And what did exist was developed ad hoc to manage singular employees' transitions on a one-off basis. So we strove to create a policy that was comprehensive enough that it could be useful to a wide variety of city departments. Because, as I've stated, not everybody works, in the same environment in the city. We have people who work behind desks. We have folks who are picking up the trash, law enforcement officers all over the city in different job functions and different departments. And so we wanted to build a situation where no matter what department in the city of Philadelphia you were in, or who your human resources representative was, or how personally knowledgeable they are on LGBTQ issues, that they had the resources and guidance that they needed to support you in your process of transitioning and to be affirming to who you are as an individual. Now, once we had clarity of focus, we began to prioritize the various operational components of this policy, and one such component was the timeline that I mentioned earlier, which included everything from guidance around updating your pronouns in the workplace to a mechanism for changing your declared name if you wanted it to appear in places like name tags or email addresses, other places where it would be used by your colleagues. And once the guidance was finalized earlier this year and we began to roll it out across the city, we found there was a surprising number of employees for whom this had a collateral benefit. That is, while our policies were designed to be supportive of our trans employees specifically, they've also benefited those who don't identify as LGBTQ. I'll give you one example. A colleague who works in the city who identifies as cisgender and heterosexual, because of the way his name is spelled, was continually misgendered. So people that had never met him before would send emails and say, "Thank you for the help, ma'am," or "She helped me with this." And because he began to include pronouns in his email signature, which was a critical aspect of our policy guidance, he had helped to create a more affirming workplace environment for himself. Now, again, this policy was prepared with transgender people in mind because our society is famously cumbersome and difficult for trans people, and it's particularly difficult for trans folks in this country to change their name legally to be affirming for who they are. But with our new policy in place, we've been able to see firsthand what a positive difference we can make with some simple operational changes that help our employees feel supported, be able to use the name that they go by, and without having to go through the lengthy and often cost-prohibitive legal process of changing their name. Those are just a few examples of the benefits of this work, and we're so pleased that after many months of development, we were finally able to roll this policy out while simultaneously continuing to collect data on the representative makeup of our LGBTQ workforce. And that brings me to today. Now, an emerging component of this work that we're in the development stage of as we speak, which is how we can apply the lessons we've learned of our previously internally facing employee surveys and translate them into best practices for collecting data from the Philadelphia public. So I've been sitting in on work groups with some of the City of Philadelphia's data scientists from the Office of Integrated Data for Evidence and Action, the Public Health Department, Behavioral Health, colleagues in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and all over the city to develop some more centralized guidance specifically on collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data from our LGBTQ residents. So I've been a member of this steering committee for a couple of months now, and we've had some very dynamic and engaging conversations about what to do with our findings and how to make them useful for specific publicly facing survey needs. Because we wanted, as a city, to be able to develop some guidance that is, again, as centralized as possible while remaining adaptable and relevant to specific needs. And I have found myself, once again, leaning into my identities not only as a community member, but also as a storyteller and social scientist. So for example, as we develop language around capturing gender identity, we've had some robust discussions around what term to use for cisgender male people. Should respondents select an option that reads male, or is that too clinical sounding? What about the word man, which I had an almost like visceral reaction to? For some reason, when referring myself to a man, I've long felt hesitant, just, I don't know. In some cases, the word man is altogether inappropriate. For example, in a survey from the Philadelphia Pre-Kindergarten Program, asking respondents to select the gender of their child, it seems inaccurate to refer to a child as a man rather than a boy. Now, similarly, I'm a strong advocate that one should never ask what is commonly referred to as biological sex or the sex someone was assigned at birth, because more often than not, it's not especially relevant. However, in a healthcare setting, like the Public Health Department, if they're surveying community members, it may be useful or relevant to ask that exact question, which is exactly what this working group is here to discuss and hopefully answer those kinds of questions, using our lived experience to inform the data experts and city leaders how to collect this valuable information from the public in an affirming and intentional way. Now, all of this is to say I have had some very meaningful experiences to this point in my career that illustrate the power of owning one's personal identity and leveraging it to get something done for the greater good. And at times, it's definitely taken more coaxing and convincing to really see that and unlock that potential in myself. But the fact remains that we are all made up of many intersectional and overlapping identities, some being privileged, some being marginalized, but it is the ownership of the entirety of ourselves that provides us the opportunity to show up in the world and make change for good. My work, not only with the City of Philadelphia as a social impact leader and as a former storyteller through art and costume and how we present ourselves to the world, has brought me to this point and delivered me an opportunity which I never imagined would be possible, which is to make an impact on some of the most vulnerable residents in one of the largest cities in our country. But I wouldn't have been able to make the impact that I have without my ability to stand in my own power and own who I am as a person. So I think back to my early conversations with Amber Hikes about owning my privilege, weaponizing it for the greater good. And I think back to conversations with Selena and other colleagues over the years who have encouraged me to show up authentically as myself and be proud of who I am and what I have to offer and what I bring to the table. And so I am very honored to have been invited to speak with you all today and share some of the amazing work that I'm so proud to have supported during my time with this great city. And my message to you all is that I urge you to remain humble and teachable, open to new experiences, but confident in your own lived experiences, being proud of who you are and your unique gifts, and not diminishing yourself or your skills or your talents for anyone. And I'm hoping that this message is resonating for those who need to hear it. And so I say specifically, if you have ever been marginalized for some aspect of your identity, that is exactly the part of yourself that you need to embrace and let out, because that is your unique power. That is your secret weapon. And that is what you have to offer that nobody else can. Bring with you a fierce passion and determination to accomplish good things. It is an ongoing process that has brought me confidence in times of uncertainty, which I say to you now as an individual, frankly, with an uncertain future. My future with the city of Philadelphia, which is soon to welcome in a new mayoral administration, may be uncertain. But one thing I am certain of is that I can leave knowing that I've made an impact because of who I am and because of what I've proudly brought to the table. And that's worth its weight in gold. And so I say to you all, happy LGBTQ Pride Month. I'm so thrilled that you're here at this great time in our city and our community's history. Philadelphia is abundant with opportunities to learn, participate, and engage with history. And if you happen to be available tomorrow over lunch and you're so inclined, you're cordially invited as my personal guest to join me outside City Hall, where we will be raising the More Color, More Pride flag to kick off Pride season for the last time with this mayoral administration. But let me just close by saying I am again so appreciative to be here with you all today and to share some insights from my process. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for welcoming me and allowing me the opportunity to help affirm you all as well as storytellers through data and as individuals who seek to make a positive impact in an unjust world for all of our diverse communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was wonderful. And it's very affirming to hear the connections of the kind of work we do, which tends to be more academic, with the kind of work that you're doing as an activist and working with the city of Philadelphia. We have lots of times for questions, so if there are questions in the audience. And Michael Bergstrand, where's Michael? Okay, let me know if there's a chat question back there.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was truly inspiring.
Thank you.
My name is Anne. I work at UC Berkeley. I'm originally from Philadelphia, though.
Welcome
so
home.
Super, thank you. I'm just interested to hear a little bit, it's not really the subject of what you talked about, but comparing some of the offices, what you call your sister offices. Like, what is sort of the kind of trends in creating these offices, and how does Philly lead the way, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So like I said, Philadelphia was one of the first offices back in 2015 when we officially became part of the city charter, which just means that we are, permanently staffed now. So no matter the change of administration, it can't be eliminated with the swipe of a pen, which is wonderful. I think, to be honest, there was a real increase in these offices across the country during the last presidential administration, because it was really the municipal governments who were stepping up and making sure that there were, protections in place for LGBTQ people. But there are definitely differences regionally or from office to office, so that depends on where the office is housed within the municipal government, for example. So we're in the mayor's office specifically, which is why I say I have an uncertain future. We have a new mayor coming in. Maybe she'll like me and I'll get to stay. Maybe she won't. I don't know. So we'll see. But other offices, maybe it's a representative that's a permanent fixture elsewhere in the government, or I have a bunch of colleagues that do LGBTQ work specifically in public health departments. So I would say the positionality of the office informs the work that they do for their individual cities. And I would say most commonly they're typically tied to a mayoral administration and in the mayor's office, because I think that politicians want to associate their brand with being an advocate for the community. So in my experience, most of the other offices that we work with are in the mayor's office. But like I said, I have colleagues in public health, law, things like that. Thank you.
I'll just echo again, thank you so much for your talk. I'm Jen Doty. I'm from Emory University in Atlanta, and so my question was similar to Ann's. I was wondering if you could talk more about how the data collection that you all do in Philadelphia can help inform data collection in other cities, if you all have the opportunity to share data amongst yourselves and help inform wider policy changes.
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, we work with the Atlanta office all the time. I'm good friends with the director there. But to this point, there isn't really a super sophisticated infrastructure for it, but it's part of our plan. So we have only worked together as like a working group of sibling offices for the last maybe year and a half or so. So we're still, and only meeting once a month. I mean, it's sort of, we're not doing like groundbreaking work every time we get together. Like half of our meetings are introducing ourselves to each other again, because yeah, and it's great, and I'm happy that every time we meet, there's like more people joining. Oh, this office in New Jersey, I don't even know where that is, which is great. But that is part of the plan. I think some of the future goals that we've been talking about in these working groups are strategic planning for how we can start to build effectively like a policy think tank amongst ourselves and be able to do exactly what you just described, which is share some of our findings with one another and help inform each other. But to this point, it's been relatively informal. So we'll make presentations every month, it's our turn next month or whatever, and share this information. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lauren from the University of Pennsylvania. I have a question that might be close to a lot of our hearts as information professionals. Has your office interacted with any of the recent sweep of anti-LGBTQIA book bannings that have been proposed, maybe not in Philadelphia, but around the country at a public library level, as it continues to be something that is slowly encroaching and concerns many of us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say broadly, not specifically, because we really focus our work within the city confines of Philadelphia. That's part of our purview, basically. But I revisit this idea not only as it applies to book bans, but also, bans of trans people in athletics, all kinds of things across, definitely statewide here in Pennsylvania, as I'm sure you know. Which is that, the city has a fair practices ordinance, and it's the civil rights document for the city of Philadelphia, which has protected sexual orientation, gender identity, class of people for decades here. And so within the city confines of Philadelphia, we always remind people, whether you're a resident or you're visiting, you're protected by, your rights are protected. Within our city limits. However, obviously, when you leave even places as nearby as the collar counties of Pennsylvania, of Philadelphia, you see that, your rights can be infringed upon. So we're fortunate to have a friendly governor in the governor's mansion now and have control over some aspect of the State House as well. But we do advocacy on a statewide level occasionally. There is a seat on the Governor's Commission of LGBT Affairs, which our office occupies. So we work statewide with other LGBTQ leaders, and we do advocacy in Harrisburg occasionally when things are brought to legislation.
Hey, Eric. I just want to say thank you very much as well. I'm Brenica. I'm a data librarian at the University of Windsor. Also, am doing my PhD in social work and looking at data inclusivity for LGBTQ+. So, super relevant for me to listen to you today. And I just want to ask, for the outward-facing survey, is it going to be sort of like the internal staff-based, where you're going to do population-based or sample-based? And then I'm also wondering if you're going to include variables to do intersectional analysis, so things like race and ethnicity, so the analysis can be rich and sort of reflect the intersectional nature of the population group, and if you're maybe going to collect some qualitative data as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we're still in the early stages of ideating. Right now, we're trying to develop the guidance, so what that actually operationally looks like, we're not sure yet, but what I will say is my office, the Office of LGBT Affairs, is housed in the Greater Mayor's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and our sister office within DEI is the Office for People with Disabilities. And one of the incredible things that our Office for People with Disabilities has done recently is produce a citywide survey for surveying disability residents and laying that over top of census data on a map, so we have some ability to see, where in the city and what zip codes, we have like this proportion of people with disabilities. So I think there's possibility for that. It was like a big deal at the time when this went live, I would say probably 6 months, a year ago. And so we're leaning heavily on their experience to this point to be able to do exactly things like what you just described. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing your experience with us, Eric. Kevin Manuel from Toronto Metropolitan University. Just back to the book bans there, the state of Illinois has just banned book bans, so there's a sweeping movement there, so maybe that will come to other states across your country. Yesterday, I attended a presentation from our Nigerian colleagues, and they let us know that it's illegal to collect data about LGBTQ plus data. But on the other end of the spectrum, some countries are proactively collecting data on the LGBTQ communities. So an example is the UK asked sexual orientation in their census. Canada asked gender identity in their last census. What value would there be in the US adding those questions to its census?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for the invitation to be here today, Kevin. So I will say, broadly, you can't fix what you can't see. So of course, just collecting data on this population in general is critically important. I know that the US Census has done some work to this point in like smaller surveys to survey specifically the impact of the pandemic on LGBTQ folks in the country, which I think is great, and I encourage them to continue to expand on that work. But to this point, some of the kind of holes that we have so far is that we have this inexact kind of workaround of like, well, how many same-sex like married households are there in the country, which of course only reflects such a small segment of LGBTQ folks, because that doesn't necessarily capture transgender people, that doesn't inherently capture LGBTQ people who are not married, especially since it's only been legally, available to us for not even half a decade yet in this country. So I would say that there's great value in doing so. I'm pleased to see that the census has done some work around it already, but I encourage them to do more. Thank you.
Hi, I'm monitoring our online chat, and we've got a few questions from our online participants as well.
Great.
The first is if you have any advice for those of us who are cis and white for executing our privilege effectively in various contexts. And then we've got a couple on the data. One being, how do you reassure people that they're not being put on some list or something like that? That might be different being out to colleagues than being out to supervisors or HR or those types of things. And then finally, how do you effectively tell stories with some of these kind of more limited data? Are you collecting other types of stories to humanize people in your conversations?
Great questions, thank you. So first of all, I'll say, as a white cis person myself, you heard a lot about my journey through this process. I'm always conscious of how much space I'm taking in a room, and one of the phrases that I learned from my mentor, Amber Hikes, is interrogating your surroundings. So always just be aware of like who is in the room, but also who's not there, and then why aren't they there? And what can you do with your privilege and abilities to like make sure that the people that should be there in the room and should be part of the conversation, should be represented, are actually there. So whether that's like removing barriers to access, or making things more available to people in other ways, you can use your privileges to kind of help make a more supportive environment for other folks. And then when you do get them to be in the room, shut up and let them talk. Yeah. I would say the second question around messaging, I would say about like how to make sure that folks understand that their sensitive personal information is not ending up in like a sinister database somewhere. is that it's very critically important, the communications and language piece of all of this. I mean, that has really been like central to the work that we've been doing in this working group that I referenced at the end of my remarks. So much of this is language-based. That's why we're like really going back and forth over individual word choices about how to select things. And I think part of that we've also talked about is the messaging and phrasing of the survey and whatever mechanism it takes itself. So we have talked a lot about, you know, what that sweet spot is of being detailed enough to tell people and assure them that, you know, this is why we're taking these questions and this is what we're planning to do with it, but also information fatigue being very real, because if there's a 20-page preamble before every question, then you're not going to get people to answer your surveys anyway. And then the last question, I can't believe I remembered all of these. I'm like losing the last question about storytelling and messaging the data. I got it. Is I would say, especially if you don't have maybe like much to go off of, is there's still something that you can find from that. So perfect example being the employee self-identification census that I shared earlier. I mean, when I say on the surface how many people have responded to it, you're like, wow, you've had thousands of people, that's wonderful. But I'm like, that many people out of 30,000 plus people is like not that many people. That's my scientific take on that. But what I'll say is there's still some story that we can put to that, right? And I said that in my speech, which is that what we do know is that we have a vast representation of identities across the LGBTQ spectrum, and it's represented in all of the various departments across the city. So that's a piece of story and narrative that we've been able to put together from the limited amount of information that we have, despite it not being, you know, fully representative.
I have a quick question for you. So many of us come from academic institutions, and I was wondering if you've partnered with or have plans to partner with the many academic institutions that are around in ways that we can support the work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do. There are several ways that we work together. Most of them are pretty informal. One of them is primarily just getting like free labor from graduate students of these academic institutions like myself. But yeah, we've worked with Westchester and Temple and Penn, obviously, for years. Another way that we've worked together is, I know we've worked with Penn Law in the past, specifically when they have like legal clinics and we want to do supporting work for exactly what I referenced earlier, you know, helping do like legal name changes or expungement clinics for people. There are definitely opportunities to get involved. It sort of depends on like a one-off basis. We've worked with Drexel in research of LGBTQ people who identify as autistic. For surveys, usually it's when somebody has an excellent idea and approaches us, because us being a two-person operation, our plates are very full. But if somebody, a researcher at a university in the region, has this like amazing idea and they want our support, they usually reach out, and we kind of measure our capacity at the time and go for it. A lot of times it ends up being letters of support, because they want to feel like the local government has their support behind it. So, but if you have ideas, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know you're at Penn.
We can talk later.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry. Getting all my steps today.
Hi, I'm Megan. I work at the University of Michigan. I have a question about your employee-facing survey, and specifically about how you went about choosing vocabulary for terms to describe people. You mentioned it was sort of the most commonly, the most common choices, I think, was the phrase for how to describe people. What were your considerations on deciding, like, what were common terms that should be included?
Yeah, good question. We did literature review of some guidance from, as I said, some of our sibling offices across the country have put out some guidance on this before. There are some writings on kind of survey best practices for LGBTQ people that we referenced as well. And then also just drawing on our lived experience, so myself and my boss in our office, and working with our fellow DE&I colleagues to kind of do multiple layers of review and test to make sure that this was clear and legible and understandable to people. And I can say to you right now, we have pivoted from that employee-facing survey to where we are now in what we're going to do with our public-facing work, because now we've brought in a larger team of people, more data experts, and we've been able to have kind of more engaged and robust conversations around exactly that piece. So for example, the example I gave earlier around the public-facing survey with do we say male or man or boy, we're leaning towards, I'm just telling you this now, we're leaning towards it saying exactly that, male or man or boy. Whereas for the city, for our employees, it just said man. So we've been making changes in real time, which I think is like a good sign. It means that we're teachable. Thank you for your question.
Hi, Eric. My
Hi.
name's Elizabeth, and I really enjoyed hearing your personal arc of how you came into this work. And as a fellow previous costumer, I'm
Wow.
wondering if you still make time to sew.
I do not, because sewing was like similar to writing a thesis or taking a standardized test. That was not my strong suit. I was like an artist. I did costume rendering. Being an artisan was like not my thing at all. So I don't, but I do still draw and paint and, you know, do find ways here and there to be creative. There was a period when I first started in the mayor's office that I used to joke like the only creative thing that I do clothing-wise anymore is like pick out my lapel pin or my tie, which is like kind of sad, but it's changed. I get to be more creative now. But yeah, I do miss it. I still keep it close. And like I said, I find ways to like reference it all the time. You know, we use visual storytelling in our work always. So it's good to hear that there's other people here. And like I said, the theater to like social impact pipeline is very real. Thank you.
Michael? Yeah. Okay. Oh, gosh.
I'll just say thank you again for your very inspiring story. I just wondered what time the flag raising was tomorrow. You didn't say.
The flag raising is at noon, although we run on what I like to call queer time, so we're probably going to start late. But that's usually how it works. And I don't know, forgive me, how this works with your schedule, so please, if you paid for your lunch, don't leave and like play hooky to come spend time with me. But if you want to, you can. It's free, it's accessible to the public, it's at City Hall, it's like right in the dead center of the city of Philadelphia. It's outdoors, we usually draw a great crowd. There will be drag performers and cheerleaders and all kinds of other queer things, so you're welcome to come.
Is it on a particular side of the block, like north, south?
Yeah, north side of City
North,
Hall, yep. And it'll be up all weekend, so if you want to see it after the flag raising, you can, you know, go see it in person for yourself.
Any more questions? Okay. Well, we do have coffee for everyone, if there's no more questions online. Thank you so much for all the questions. Thank you so much, Eric, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone.